We're in the middle of this series, and it's a 5-part series. Today is part 3 of the life of Joseph. And we're looking at how following God when the road seems uncertain. And actually, this is a real truth of what it was for Joseph and who he was and what his life was about. There were so many ups and downs. But we're looking this year about being disciples of Jesus Christ and getting on that journey of a disciple. And sometimes we have to go through things to get to the place where God is calling us to. And sometimes we would rather it not that way. We'd rather just kind of click our fingers and get there. I'm sure that Joseph would have rather just kind of clicked his fingers and get to the end, but that's not life. Sometimes we go through to get to the things and the place where God has called us to. Tom Sivers came into my office this morning and he said, I want you to say the story of Joseph in 10 seconds for social media. I was like, man, I'm going to start getting anxiety every time I see Tom Sivers. And then I thought, well, if I can do it in 10 seconds, why don't we just do it in 10 seconds and finish? So watch the video, band, you can come back, we're done. But I want to just kind of really briefly try and just see where we've gone. We've looked at the life of Joseph. Joseph being a young man. He was one of 12. He was the favorite of the sons. He had dreams. His brothers already hated him, but his brothers hated him even more after the dreams had come through. They decide to sell him into slavery. He gets sold into Potiphar's house. And week 1, we looked at this verse that said, the Lord was with Joseph, and he prospered. And we see, and again, this verse comes again and again, that even though life wasn't great, the Lord was with Joseph. The Lord was with him. And I want us to bear that in mind as we work our way through. He ended up being in charge of Potiphar's house. He was entrusted everything in his care, everything except that of Potiphar's wife, and God blessed everything that went on. And then we get Potiphar's wife. Potiphar's wife comes along, and Joseph, yet he runs away. He remains faithful to God and who God is, but Potiphar's wife lies, and Joseph ends up being thrown into prison. And at the back end of verse 39, it says, the Lord was with him. The Lord showed Joseph kindness. God granted him favor. He was in charge of all those in prison. He was responsible for all that goes on. The Lord was with him and gives him great success. And when we read the life of Joseph, it's really easy just to get the high points, or the highlights, of he's in a pit. Surely God wasn't with him. Surely he wasn't having success. Surely those times weren't good. He was thrown into prison. How horrible would that be? Yet the Lord was still with him and grants him success as he works his way through. Not all prison seasons are bad. Don't get yourself thrown into prison on that statement. And social media team, don't use that as like a little meme. I know what you're like. But not all prison seasons are bad. Sometimes God uses situations and places and times that we don't get and we don't understand, yet God is shaping us. And God is molding us to be the people that He has called us to be. Today I'm going to try and get through Genesis 40 and 41 in 20 minutes. So brace yourselves, strap in, and we'll see how we get on this morning. But Genesis 40, if you've got a Bible, why don't you turn there with me? I'm not going to read it all this morning. I want to really encourage you, when you get home, read it when you get home. Go back again, read Genesis 39 and some of the other verses that we've looked at as we worked our way through. Genesis 37, I think we started with as well. But Genesis 40, just the first 8 verses say this. Sometime later, the cupbearer and the baker, the king of Egypt, offered their master, the king of Egypt. Pharaoh was angry with his 2 officials, the chief cupbearer and the baker, and he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in the same prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph, and he attended to them. After they had been in custody for some time, each of the 2 men, the cupbearer and the baker, I love it just reminds us in case we've forgotten who it was, but the cupbearer and the baker, they get mentioned again and again, of the king of Egypt, who were being held in the prison. They had dreams on the same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. And when Joseph came to them the next morning, he saw that they were dejected. So he asked Pharaoh's officials in custody with him, the master of the house, why is your face so sad today? They replied and said, we both had dreams, they answered. And there is no one who can interpret our dreams. And then Joseph said to them, do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams. The cupbearer and the baker, they must have done something wrong because they end up getting thrown into prison. And they're in the same prison where Joseph is, and Joseph is in charge and sorting things through. And I thought about it. Joseph's response could have been, don't bother me. I'm waiting for my own dream to be fulfilled. Don't bother me now. Just leave me, because actually in a little while my brothers are going to come and they're going to bow down to me. Just don't bother me in this season. Don't bother me in this moment. He could have been so negative about it, but he wasn't. He recognized that there was an opportunity to serve even though he was in prison. He was able to serve even in the place where things were not going very well. He could have said, I'm just waiting, but no, he had a job to do, even in that prison season. And then the cupbaker comes, and you can follow along just to check that I'm not making this next bit up, because I'm not going to read it, but I know what it says. But they have these dreams, and the cupbearer has a dream, and there's a vine. I love it, people are actually checking, just in case I am making this up. He has a dream, and there's a vine, and there's 3 vines that are there, and there's grapes that are on there, and he has Pharaoh's cup in his hand, and he squeezes the grapes into the cup, and then he gives the cup to Pharaoh. And this is all this dream that he had, and Joseph then interprets the dream. He says the 3 branches represent that of 3 days. And he says, what's going to happen is Pharaoh, he's going to lift up your head and he's going to restore you back to the place where you were. And that's what the dream is. And then in verse 14, he says this, but when all goes well with you, Joseph says, remember me. Show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh. I've just done a good deed for you. I've just interpreted your dream for you. Surely you can do something good for me. When you get to the place of seeing Pharaoh again, just do me a favor. Do me a favor. Show me some kindness in this place. For I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews, which was when he was carried off and sold into slavery from his brothers. And even here, I have done nothing to deserve being put in prison. Remember, he was thrown into prison because Potiphar's wife lied about him. And he's thinking, I'm in this place. I've done absolutely nothing wrong. I don't deserve to be here. Please remember me. Please show me some kindness. Get me out of this situation in this place. And then the baker comes in verse 16. It doesn't say this, but I think the baker probably had a little bit of something good's going to happen. This guy, he can interpret dreams, and the cupbearer, he's going to be restored back into the same place. So verse 16, when the chief baker, he saw that Joseph had given a favorable interpretation, he said to Joseph, and it doesn't say that he was excited, but I should imagine he was, I too had a dream, and on my head were baskets of bread. And he goes on and shares this dream with him. And he says there's 3 baskets of bread, and birds, they were eating the bread that was from the baked goods on that of the basket. And Joseph, he interprets the dream. He says in 3 days. The 3 baskets represent 3 days. And he's thinking, oh, it was a good dream for the cupbearer. Maybe it is for me. And then he says, with no word of warning, maybe not the most pastoral team member on the planet at this point, he says, he's going to take off your head and he's going to hang you on a tree and the birds are going to eat of your flesh. I was going to say picture that, but don't picture that. I just think, poor guy. There was no build-up to this. Maybe the Bible just kind of skips over those bits, and maybe he kind of put his arm around him and said, I'm really sorry, mate. But poor guy, no build-up. But he definitely thought it was good for the cupbearer. Maybe it's going to be good for me also, but it wasn't good for him. And then in verse 20, now the 3rd day was Pharaoh's birthday. And he was given a feast for all of his officials. He lifted up the head of the chief cupbearer and of that of the baker in the presence of his officials. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position, which is just as it was told from that of Pharaoh and from Joseph, and he put his cup in Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker. Joseph had said to him, this was the interpretation, and this is what happened. The chief cupbearer, however, he did not mention Joseph. He forgot him. He forgot him. The dreams came true. The dreams were interpreted correctly by that of Joseph. But the issue for Joseph was he was forgotten. he was still in prison. He was left and he was forgotten. And I just think in this moment of all that is going on, he just gets forgotten and he gets left, this poor guy. If you look back over his life, he was hated. His brothers were unkind to him. They wanted to kill him. They threw him into a cistern. They claim his death. They strip him of his robes. They stage a death. They go and play along with the death story. Then he's wrongfully imprisoned, yet God shows him favor. And then he's totally forgotten and just left, sat there in this prison cell. Joseph, he remains faithful, even though he must have felt totally forgotten. You know, have you ever been in a place where you felt like you've just been wronged? Where you feel like you've been forgotten, where you feel kind of bitter about a life situation that has come your way. And maybe there's times and situations where that has happened for you. But my question is, what's our response when those situations and those times come? When someone wrongs us, when someone forgets us, when someone sidelines us, when someone else gets pushed to the front and you get pushed to the back. How do we respond in those moments? It's so easy just to become bitter. And Joseph so easily could have just become bitter in that moment. But he chooses to remain faithful, knowing that God is with him. God will follow this through. God will see him through all that he has called him to. And maybe he's sat there in his prison cell thinking, maybe the cupbearer, he'll come back tomorrow. Maybe he'll come back tomorrow. Or maybe he'll come back tomorrow. But he doesn't. He has to wait in this moment, and he waits, and he waits, and he waits. The NIV Study Bible says this: when we feel passed by, overlooked, or forgotten, we shouldn't be surprised that people are often ungrateful. In similar situations, trust God as Joseph did, because more opportunities may be waiting for us. Waiting for God. Waiting for him, hanging in there, knowing, as Karen has already said, that God, he draws near to us. It's a promise that he draws near. And as I shared earlier, the Lord was with Joseph in all of these seasons, in all of these moments, even in the total forgottenness. He's there, and he has the Lord with him. Genesis 41, verse 1. When 2 full years had passed by, Pharaoh had a dream and he was standing by the Nile. It's really easy to skip over that, isn't it? 2 full years have gone by. It's like, come on. This wasn't like, oh, maybe in a couple of days' time. This was 2 full years. 2 full years had gone by of him waiting and seeing and thinking maybe he'll come, maybe he'll be here in a moment. But 2 full years go by and Pharaoh, he has a dream. And he's out standing by the Nile, and 7 cows come out, and 7 cows are sleek and fat cows, and they're there grazing. And after those cows come 7 other cows, and these cows are ugly and gaunt. And the ugly, gaunt cows eat up the sleek, fat cows. And then Pharaoh, he then wakes from his dream. And then he goes back to sleep again. And he has a second dream. And there's 7 heads of grain that are good and healthy on this single stalk. Then there are 7 other heads of grain that sprouted that are scorched by that of the east wind. And then the thin heads swallow up the healthy heads. And then Joseph, I keep saying Joseph. We're in the theme of Joseph. Pharaoh. If I say Joseph, I mean Pharaoh, okay? And if I say Pharaoh, I mean Joseph, okay? That's why you have to check that I'm not making it up, that's for sure. That's definitely what's going on there. But he's there in this place, and he wakes up again, and he's troubled by these dreams. Pharaoh's troubled by what he's seen or pictured or dreamt in that moment. And so he calls the magicians and he calls the wise men, and those people would do this kind of thing. They would interpret dreams, but they were unable to interpret the dream on this day. No one could interpret them for him, verse 8 tells us. And then in verse 9 we see that the cupbearer, 2 full years later, is like, oh yeah, I remember now. There's a guy who can interpret dreams. Let's see if we can get this guy to come along. I think the cupbearer was a little bit brave in this point. You can read this or just follow along. He starts to retell the story of what had happened. I'd be thinking, I just wouldn't rake up the past. Like, don't rake up the past of what's gone on there. But he goes into full flow. He's like, Pharaoh, do you remember you were angry with me? Do you remember you were angry with me and the baker? And you were angry with us and you threw us into prison. But he tells them, he said, I had a dream. And the baker had a dream. And Joseph, this man, this young man who was in the prison, he can interpret dreams. Let's get him to see whether he can come and interpret these dreams of all that was dreamt. And then in verse 14 and verse 41, so Pharaoh sent for Joseph. He was quickly brought before him from the dungeon when he shaved and changed all of his clothes, and he then was presented to Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I had a dream and no one can interpret them, but I've heard of it that you can interpret dreams. And then Joseph says, I can't do it. He says, I can't do it. Joseph replied, but God will give Pharaoh the answer that he needs. Joseph was so quick to say, this is not about me. But I serve a living God. And I know that he will be able to give you the answer that you need. It would have been so easy for Joseph in that moment to have just wandered with a bit of a big head and go, yes, I can interpret dreams. I interpreted the dream of the baker and that of the cupbearer. But you'll notice as we read through that part, or if you look back over that part, Joseph was really quick to say it's about God. He pointed him back to God. And then in this moment, in front of Pharaoh, he points him back to God. And he says, I can't, but I know someone who can. I know someone who can interpret these dreams. And then he says there's going to be 7 years of great abundance. There is going to be such an abundance in the land, but also there's going to be 7 years of famine. There's going to be 7 amazing years, and then there's going to be 7 of the worst years that there will be to come. 7 years, and then 7 years work their way through. And then in verse 32, the reason the dream was given to Pharaoh in 2 forms is that the matter has been firmly decided by God, and God will do it soon. I haven't looked into this, and perhaps I shouldn't say it then because I haven't looked into it. But it's interesting. Joseph knows this dream's going to happen quickly. But his own dream of his brothers bowing down was like 20-something years in the making. But he knows. He knows this that's going to happen is going to happen quickly. Something needs to be done about this super, super quickly. So then, in verse 33, and now, let Pharaoh look for a discerning and a wise man and put him in charge of the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh appoint a commissioner over the land and take 1/5 of the harvest of Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. They should collect all the food for the years of these goods that are coming and store up the grain under the authority of Pharaoh to be kept in the cities for food. And this food should be held in reserve for the country so that it can be used during the 7 years of famine that is about to come and that will be there in this place and in this moment. And Pharaoh, he comes and he says, this seems like a good idea. This seems like a good place. This sounds like a good plan. And we want to put you in charge of that. We want you to be the one who is working this through. You can read that from verses 37 onwards down to 40. He recognizes and he says, I want you to be the one. Can we find someone who can do this kind of thing? And he says, I want to put you in charge of making all of that happen. He went from being the favorite to that of being hated, to being sold, to being put in charge in prison, to be in charge in the whole land of Egypt. And he says that people will submit to you. He says, I'm going to give you this signet ring. I'm going to give you a robe that is that of linen. I'm going to put a gold chain around your neck. I'm going to give you a chariot. You're going to be second in command. People are going to shout, make way for this guy who is coming through. And I should imagine Joseph would have loved to have missed out the middle season of his life. But he had to go through to get to. He had to go through all of those moments to get to the place where God has called to. But he had to journey that on the way. He had to journey it through. To go through the mess and to go through the pain, to go through the forgottenness, to go through the years and the years and the years that he had to go through to get to that place. And then it goes on to say that everything happened just as Joseph said it would be. The dreams were interpreted correctly. So Joseph is put in charge, and Joseph sorts everything out for the 7 years of plenty, so that come the 7 years of famine, they will be okay. And then in verse 46 of chapter 41, Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. And Joseph went from Pharaoh's presence and traveled throughout Egypt. He starts out 2 chapters or 3 chapters earlier as a 17-year-old young lad. And now he's 30 years old. These years that he went through, this 13 years of being there, and his dreams that he had must have felt like a lifetime ago. And yet that dream still isn't going to be fulfilled for another kind of 7 years. They must have felt like an age has kind of gone by, an age that must have passed its way through. But just because the dreams felt like a long way away, it doesn't mean that God wasn't there. It doesn't mean that God wasn't near. It doesn't mean that Joseph was forgotten. We would so love to just do a shortcut. God, is there not just a quicker way? Can we not just miss this stage and this phase of my life now? Can we not just miss out this bit that's going on here? But sometimes we have to go through to get to the things that God has in store for us. We have to get to that place to know who God is in those moments. And what do we learn from these passages? What can we see? What kind of comes out for us in these moments? Well, these things come through and bring truth for us, even in hardship, even in the pit, even being sold, even being accused of wrong, even being imprisoned, even being forgotten, even in the pain, even in the trauma, even in those bitter memories of life. God is faithful. He's faithful to his promises. His timing may not be our timing. As I say, we'd like just to speed things up sometimes, but God's timing isn't our timing. But God is faithful, and the Lord, he was with Joseph. You can see it all the way through. Genesis 39, verse 2. Genesis 39, 3. Genesis 39, 21. Genesis 39, 23. Genesis 41, 38. We read where it says that we need someone who the Spirit of God is on. And Joseph was that man. And even in all of those moments, even in all of those places, the Lord was with him. And church, I want to say to you this morning, whatever the pit, whatever the cistern, whatever the pain, whatever the prison, whatever the entrapped slavery type season may be for you, the Lord is with you. And there are promises that are in Scripture that are true for you. There are so many that we can read of and that we can find that God is true to his promises. God doesn't forget. He's not a cupbearer with a bad memory. He's a God who is faithful and a God who is true. And sometimes life may feel like it's on pause. But these are seasons of growth where we go, God, I don't know why I feel like things aren't moving on. But I'm trusting in you. I'm trusting your faithfulness. I'm trusting you for who you are, your goodness, and I'm choosing to forgive. I'm choosing to be someone who's going to move on from a place of bitterness to a place of saying, God, you are faithful. God, I don't get it, but you're faithful. You're faithful and true to your promises. If the band would perhaps come. We're going to sing a song in just a moment's time, but I want us to just really interestingly, I love, if I was to give you the Joseph story in 10 seconds, you can see that on social media later on. But if I was to give you that, you miss so much detail that goes on. And there is so much detail, so please do read through these verses later on, but there's some amazing parts. Joseph, he gets married. And Joseph, he has 2 children. You can see this, I'm not making it up. He has one who is called Manasseh. And it means it is because God has made me forget all my trouble of that of my father's house. He has another child called Ephraim. And it is because God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering. He names his children of that of who he knows God is. He could have named his children of what the meaning was for prison and bitterness. But he chose to say, God is good to me. And every time I see my child, I'm going to remember that God has helped me to forget how rubbish my family was to me. And in that moment of having his other child, he looks at that child and he says, I know that I'm going to look at my child, and every time I see my child, you're going to remind me that God is faithful and fruitful in the land of my suffering. And I want to encourage you to have reminders in your life. Don't rename your children. But in your mind, have reminders in your life. Have things that are in your world that would remind you that God is faithful. Have things in your world that would be a reminder that God can be trusted. Have reminders in your world and in your life that God is faithful and God is true. And discipleship sometimes means seasons of waiting. And discipleship means seasons of pruning. But discipleship means seasons of quiet obedience and trusting who God is.